I'm Scott Hansen, host of NFL Red Zone. Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. That's why we're here to help you get your next DIY project done, even when the clock isn't on your side. Whether that's a new Filtrete filter or Bosch and Cobalt power tools, Lowe's has everything you need to feel like the MVP of DIY. So get it done and earn your Sunday. Shop now in-store and online. Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
Brewing a batch of beer involves various steps, one of which is the mash, where after blending the milled grain with warm water, enzymes are activated that convert starches into fermentable sugar. While some brewers opt to leave their mash undisturbed for the duration of the rest, others prefer recirculating the mash, claiming it has various benefits. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to chat about mash recirculation.
I think mash recirculation is one of the most exciting things for me when I was moving from that standard igloo cooler batch mash system up to an electric system. You know, the idea that you have this automated system that's recirculating your mash, keeping those temperatures constant, maybe extracting more sugar and making a more efficient wort was one of the most exciting things about going to these kind of all-in-one type systems like I have the claw hammer. But does it really matter?
Yeah, I can relate with that feeling of being excited about, for me, I started recirculating my mash through the purchase of an actual pump, like an outside pump, prior to me ever going electric. And, it was one of those variables that I have quite a bit of experience with, though, as much as I did it back then, I haven't done it in probably close to a decade at this point. I haven't even really thought much about it outside of experiments like the one we're going to talk about in this episode. So I do look forward to getting into our reasons for doing what we do, as well as going over the results of that experiment. Now, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to either a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor or a Q&A with somebody in the brewing world. Learn more about all of the rewards we have to offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we would appreciate that, as well as it helps those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we really do appreciate knowing what it is you think about how we're doing. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt for 10-gallon setup, for 10-gallon batches, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag home brewing starter kits. If you've been considering going electric, though, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used both their 120 and 240-volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not quite ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. But if you are considering going electric, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. All right, listener Clayton Latham from Huntington Beach, California, wrote in with some interesting feedback on malt and its impact on hops, as well as an experiment suggestion, saying, Julian Schrago of Beechwood Brewing has mentioned that he'll add a tiny amount of honey malt to tropical IPA beers because the slight sweetness sort of makes the tropical hop character seem sweeter and therefore hoppier. Experiment? Maybe better to test this one on a low gravity beer, like one of the beers is all base malt and the other beer recipe is 3 to 7% base malt with crystal 10 or 1 to 4% honey malt, and see if the malt sweetness can be perceived as more fruity hop character. What are, as a purist in the West Coast IPA world here, Jordan, I'm so curious what your thoughts are on Julian Schrago's use of, or at least what it sounds like he has said before, use of a small amount of honey malt in these tropical IPAs.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and I could see how various components of the brew day could interact with hop character and ultimately the perception of the drinker. I have not tried this. I love making, tropical leaning West Coast IPAs. I am wondering if he's using these in his hazies, or West Coast or both. I don't know how much hazy IPA Beach would actually even make. So maybe it is more on the West Coast side, but I know that you've used honey malt, quite a bit in your brewing in the past. I don't think I've ever used that grain. Maybe in the first couple of years of brewing when I didn't know what I was doing, but it's just, I'm very simple. I tend to make beers that are 100% Pilsner malts, basically. And so, I used to use a little bit of Carahel, and I've kind of even dropped that. And so, in my West Coast IPAs. So, as someone that loves making New Zealand forward IPAs, I'd love to give this a shot. And as you know, I'm always looking for excuses to find some sort of variable I can test in a West Coast IPA or West Coast Pils format.
Yeah.
So I think this is a really cool idea, and I'd love to see it for myself, but I don't have any experience with that approach, let alone really that grain.
Yeah. That's wild to me that you've never used honey malt. It's one of those, in my experience, and it's one of those malts that it seems a lot of people who have never used it love to shit on. They hate it for whatever reason. And there's this idea that it's like really sweet, and in my experience, even up to like 10% of the grist, when honey malt makes up about 10%, it never really comes across, at least to my palate, it doesn't really come across as sweet so much as it does like nutty cereal. I tell people it doesn't taste like honey to me. It tastes like honey bunches of oats, that flavor profile. And I happen to like it. So, Clayton, interestingly, about 13 years ago or so, I published a recipe that it's not even just for patrons. It's just one that's in our recipe page on our website. You can go check it out now. It's called A Little Slack IPA. And it was based originally off of a recipe that my twin brother had brewed called No Slack IPA. And I did a play on words because I tweaked it for myself. And that recipe all it is 80% pale two-row malt, 14% Munich, light Munich, and then 6% honey malt. So that's about 12 ounces for a 5-gallon batch. And that recipe is one of the only ones I don't really compete very much. And when I was competing, it was mostly lagers. This is one that actually took a silver in a local competition. And it was one of the only IPAs I've ever competed with. And it did really well. I've always liked this recipe. Now, you are asking if Julian is using it, honey malt in his hazies, or if it's in his clearer, crisper West Coast IPAs. I would imagine it would work kind of similarly if this thing that Clayton is proposing is actually real, if we can determine that it has a perceptible impact, I would imagine it'd work equally as fine in both, because it's all he's claiming is that sweetness from that small amount of honey malt is in some way coaxing out more of that fruity impression from those hops. And if it's doing that in a West Coast IPA, I'd imagine it would do it equally as well in a hazy IPA. So I think it's a neat idea and a very easy experiment for us to design. What we would probably do is one beer that is 100% say Pilsner malt, and the other one 100% or 95% Pilsner malt, 5% honey malt, or something like that, right? I mean, that sounds fair, right?
Yeah, and I would love to actually try this in a West Coast IPA with some sugar and some enzyme and really dry it out so that it's not a function of FG, but more of a function of like whatever, character that this malt may be providing, just from the flavor alone, not so much sweetness from residual sugars.
Yeah, you've been doing this long enough now, Jordan, that our approach is that as long as everything between the beers is identical with the exception of the variable in question, then it's fair game. Let's do it. So thanks for the suggestion, Clayton. I'm excited to see how this one turns out. And in a weird way, I might get some validation for my wild use of honey malt, which some people just absolutely can't believe anybody would add to a beer like an IPA. So interesting stuff. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Speaking of social media, if you follow us on Facebook or Instagram or wherever else we might have a presence, you may have already heard that Brülosophy merch is back, and we are offering way more options than we ever have before. Of course, there are t-shirts and hoodies, but we're also selling things like hats, fanny packs, shorts, coffee mugs, tank tops, mobile phone cases, and stickers, among other things. We've been asked about this for years, and we are very excited to finally be able to offer yet another way for our fans to support what it is that we're doing while receiving something tangible in return. And if you're among the many people who have reached out complaining because they've been unable to get our merch in the past because people don't ship, or Amazon or whatever it is doesn't ship outside of the United States or North America, well, now you can. The company that we're working with ships around the world to most countries around the world. You can check out all of our merch by heading to brulosophy.com/shop. That's brulosophy.com/SHOP, and then clicking one of the product images on that page, which will redirect you to our Dashery store, or you can just go directly to our store at brulosophy.dashery.com. We've put a link in the description of this episode. Currently, we're offering all of our classic designs, though we do have plans to create some new fun designs in the future. And hey, if you've got some ideas, feel free to shoot them our way. Feedback at brulosophy.com. We'll give everything a fair shake. Again, click the link to the description or head to brulosophy.com/shop to finally get some Brülosophy merch. Alrighty, we'll be right back.
October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, a reminder that your digital life is always at risk. Every day, hackers steal identities, drain bank accounts, and open fraudulent accounts. LifeLock is here with tips to help prevent you from becoming a victim. Use strong passwords, set up multi-factor authentication on your accounts, report scams, and update the software on your devices. And for peace of mind, get LifeLock. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats to your identity. If your identity is stolen, a LifeLock US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Plus, LifeLock plans include the $1 Million Protection Package, meaning LifeLock will reimburse you to your plan's limits if you lose money due to identity theft. Stay smart, stay safe, and stay protected. Get comprehensive identity protection with a 30-day free trial at LifeLock.com. Use promo code NEWS. That's LifeLock.com, promo code NEWS for 30 days free. Terms apply.
Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. At the time I switched from extract to all grain, I was downright terrified of this thing called hot side aeration. Ooh, the boogeyman of brewing. So once my mash was all well incorporated, I would just leave it alone until it was time to collect the sweet wort. I definitely knew of some folks, though, who took a different approach, and this ended up influencing me to start recirculating my mashes again. I had to buy, an external pump and get that all set up, and what a pain that was. But nowadays, it seems pretty standard in these electric brewing rigs to have a way to just press a button and recirculate the mash. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of mash recirculation, let's start by focusing first on what exactly the mash is. I feel like it's only through understanding what's happening during the mash that we might be able to grasp why some people might think that recirculation is a good thing.
Marshall, I have a question for you. In your opinion, would you agree that mash is the most soothing part of the brew day?
I think one, you're not adding hops at different points in the boil, so you don't have your timer is just for the mash. So yes, soothing there, but the smell of it there's something about
oh my gosh,
the smell of a mash that it's just every single time, 1,000 batches later, you're gonna have that same enjoyment as you did on your first batch. At least I do, and so yeah, I would agree.
I love it. The smell and the method, just like stirring, like with the old school igloo, or just like, I guess you have to mash in with your mash paddle, even an all-in-one, right? Something about it, it's just soothing. Mashing is a vibe, and I absolutely love it. And like you said, hundreds of batches later, I still love it. So, what is a mash? Well, it's pretty simple. We're just simply crushing malted cereal grains, often barley, sometimes wheat, etc. And then we're steeping that in hot water for a period of time. And during that time, this hot water is interacting with the malts to actually activate these endogenous enzymes that then go on to convert the grain starches into fermentable sugars.
Yeah, and by endogenous, we just mean that they're there already, and then by mixing that crushed grain, that crushed malt, and it has to be malt in order to get this conversion. So, you're not going to just go get barley out of the field and be able to make, it has to be malted first, because that's what activates those enzymes, or gets those starches prepared for this. And then those enzymes that are already there anyways just get activated. And temperature is a big key thing with mash, with the mash, and what it ends up happening in the end. For those who may not be familiar with mashing or all grain brewing, lower mash temperatures tend to favor beta amylase. We're talking 146 to 152 Fahrenheit or so. That's about 63 to 66 C. And this is going to produce shorter chain sugars that are more readily metabolized by yeast, leading to higher attenuation and thus more alcohol in the finished beer. On the other end of the spectrum, when you mash warmer, in between about 156 to 162 Fahrenheit or 69 to 72 C, alpha amylase enzymes are going to be activated, which produce these longer chain dextrins that aren't as easily metabolized by yeast, resulting in lower attenuation and thus less alcohol. These days, I'm just going to come out and say it right up front. I know a lot of people still hang on to this idea that higher mash temperatures will result in a sweeter beer. We have not been able to show that, not once. It does result in more long chain dextrins that apparently are not very sweet perceptibly, but they do result in lower fermentation. So to me, I use mash temperature these days just as a way to, manipulate the finished ABV of a beer.
If you go back and listen to one of our latter episodes of the Brew Lab, Kate and I actually did kind of a meta-analysis looking at all of the mash temperature experiments that we could find on the website. And we saw two consistent trends. One, higher mashes tend to yield higher FG beers. But two, tasters really struggle to tell them apart. And so I think there's got to be a threshold, and I think I said this on the episode, that like comparing a 1050 FG versus like a 1.000 FG, surely you could tell a difference there. But a few points, even like 5 standard gravity points difference, tasters really struggle to tell the difference. So it's not that a higher FG isn't inherently sweeter, but I think that when we're on the margins, it's pretty negligible.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. That we've actually done some comparisons, mash temperature comparisons. That the beers were almost a 1.5 percentage wise in ABV different from each other. And I would have thought before we started doing this experimentation, I would have thought that my goodness, that's easily going to be perceptible, that difference, and it's just not. Even the brewers can't tell them apart. The odd thing is, and I can't reference the exact article right now. When we started doing these mash temperature experiments back in the day, we started actually looking into like lab research, actual research articles. And lo and behold, we found a few that went along and were saying, yeah, these long chain dextrins that people think, contribute a perceptible sweetness to beer. Actually, people can't pick up a sweet flavor from them at all. So we're not the only ones who have, discovered this or anything like that. We're kind of adding to the evidence that's already there on a sensory level. So I think it's really interesting. That being said, mash temperature is not the only focus of this episode, so we'll move on from that. I think when we're talking about the mash, it behooves us to focus a little bit on this idea of efficiency. You hear it talked about all the time. You've got brewers who are efficiency chasers. You've got, people who really strive to have the highest efficiency. Well, what are they actually referring to? When it comes to efficiency, there are two main ways that it can be talked about. One is mash efficiency. Now, mash efficiency, I feel like a lot of people use mash efficiency, but really mean brew house efficiency and vice versa. Mash efficiency is just a measure of the percentage of fermentable sugars that are actually extracted from grain during the mash and sparge relative to this theoretical maximum. So it's always measured post-lauter and pre-boil. Primarily, this is affected by your grain crush, your mash pH, water chemistry, and the way in which you are lautering your grains. So, you often hear people talk about fly sparging resulting in higher efficiency. Yes, you are going to extract more sugars, typically at least, when you fly sparge or continuously sparge, which is one of the reasons a lot of commercial brewers still do that, because for them, that efficiency equals dollars and cents, Now, this when we're talking about mash efficiency, it is very helpful in determining problems with mashing, sparging, and the lautering process, but it's not terribly useful otherwise when we're talking about other losses in the brewing process. And that's where brewhouse efficiency comes in. This is a measure of a brewery's total system performance, including starch conversion, so mash efficiency, as well as things like your mash tun and kettle losses, your boil off rate, trub loss, etc. So a lower mash efficiency, this is the way I like to think about it. A lower mash efficiency will ultimately result in lower brewhouse efficiency, but a low brewhouse efficiency is not always the result of poor mash efficiency. This is I don't know, Jordan, this is something that I feel like it used to get talked about a lot back when, we were in the height of brewing and home brewing and such. But these days, maybe it doesn't come up as much because people have kind of embraced just getting lower mash efficiency, doing no sparge on an electric brewing system.
Yeah, I kind of agree, actually. I think that the advent of these purpose-built systems has kind of shifted the conversation away from kind of like technology kinetics and chasing numbers towards just like recipe design and like really a lot of cold side talk now.
Yeah.
I think that when we were cobbling together systems from, parts from a shed of various, originally intended, devices, we were really just trying to make beer with whatever we could, cobble together. And so I think that it kind of led itself to conversations around system performance, mash efficiency, et cetera. And, kind of like the days of homebrew talk, being of yesteryear, you just don't really have this conversation happening as much anymore now that everyone's got these dialed in systems that come in a box.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. I think part of the interest for a certain generation, which I happen to be included in, of homebrewers was the kind of nerdy, fun side of making everything more efficient and getting the best numbers and then comparing that with your buddy's numbers and all of that. And it seems nowadays that's just not necessarily much of a concern. And maybe that was influenced by the rising popularity of these awesome, all-in-one electric brewing systems, most of which allow you to brew an entire batch without having to sparge or at all. You're just basically brew in a bag in a stainless basket. So now, if we take mash temperature and mash efficiency, or efficiency in general, and you put those together, it allows us to more easily talk about mash recirculation, because both of those are at play when it comes to the reasoning one might opt to recirculate their mash. Now, just before I hand this off to you, Jordan, because you've done far more recirculation than I have, a little definition about, what are we referring to when it comes to mash recirculation? This is simply the process where wort is continuously drawn from the bottom of a mash tun and then returned to the top, ideally in a closed loop, right? You don't want it being, who knows about hot side aeration? You've got some people out there who swear it has a negative impact on beer, but I'm not going to intentionally try to oxidize my sweet wort while it's in the mash. So closed loop, you're like the claw hammer system. It goes right into the top of the lid on your kettle and it squirts over the top of the mash bed. And it's just a nice recirculation, which has some very real benefits, at least in terms of what we can see during the mash. This is typically done with a pump, which is increasingly more common, again, like I said today, with these electric brewing rigs, because they're just built in anyways, making it very simple. Most people probably don't even think about it these days when they're using these types of systems.
Yeah, and so you see a few different ways in which this is accomplished. One is kind of like it goes directly into like a fly sparge rig. So it's like several holes like in a circular piece of copper or something that are spraying on top of the mash bed. Like you said, the claw hammer, it's a single source where it's a single sprayer in the middle that goes over the mash bed. A lot of these newer systems just use a tube, and it's like a flow of water out of a tube, or wort, directly on top of the mash bed, and you can see how there could be some quote channeling issues with some of these systems where it's the flow of the wort is kind of concentrated in one specific area. The coolest system I've ever seen is the German Braumeister, which sucks it from the bottom and pushes it up a tube, and then it slowly cascades on the sides back down. So there's actually it does use a pump, and in the case of the one I have, it uses 2 pumps to achieve this, but it doesn't just spray it on top. It's like this inverted mash recirc, and allegedly that's the lowest oxygen exposure option in the common homebrewing all-in-ones. And so there's a variety of ways in which it's recirculated, and maybe some are more effective than others.
Yeah, I think in fact when I reference the folks who are just wholly convinced about hot side aeration having being a negative thing, that's primarily the low oxygen brewing or Lodo brewers out there who are making these traditional German lagers using these processes, and I believe the Braumeister is their preferred all-in-one unit for. That being one of the many reasons is it really does reduce that hot side aeration. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as one of the potential downsides and get into what hot side aeration is and all of that. But what are the benefits of mash recirculation? I mean, we discussed mash temperature earlier. So when you recirculate your mash, it reduces the risk. It doesn't fully take it away unless you have a very well-designed system, but it certainly reduces the risk of there being temperature stratification in your mash, meaning that the bottom is, hotter than the middle, which is hotter than the top, and whatever ills can come from that, whether it's, inconsistent conversion, stuff like that. So you're going to have more uniform temperature in the mash, which ensures the temperature, again, is consistent throughout that entire grain bed, again, which many believe will help the enzymes function more effectively. So that is one big reason. If you are aiming for a beer that is going to have a very specific OG when mashed at 158 degrees Fahrenheit, and parts of your mash are down at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, that's frustrating. You want that consistency because you are aiming for predictability and consistency there. So again, temperature uniformity, one of the main reasons people would recirculate their mash, but there are other ones as well.
Yeah, another one we might want to be chasing here is mash efficiency, and we could maybe chase that through the recirculation approach because you're constantly moving the wort through the grain bed, and so it's kind of like a auto sparge during the mashing process, right, where you're exposing those available starches to more active enzymes, and in theory leading to a more complete conversion of starches into fermentable sugars, and ultimately higher mash efficiency.
Yeah. So again, for those of us who are, like to geek out on improving our numbers, by recirculating, ostensibly, you are increasing the chances that you are going to get the highest mash efficiency out of that. Not necessarily brew house. You might still have super low brew house efficiency because of all of your losses, and that is not a terrible thing. But you're confident that you're extracting as much sugar out of those grains as possible. The other benefit, and the last one we'll talk about here, but this is one that used to, again, I feel like it used to get more focus than it does today. Maybe I'm just not in those circles anymore, but it's wort clarity. We're all very well aware that grain beds act like natural filters, right? So the wort is pulled through this grain bed before coming out of the kettle or your mash tun and being returned to the top of the grain bed, thereby trapping smaller grain particles and other solids, creating a clearer wort. Now, many believe this idea that clear wort leads to clear beer. So why wouldn't you do something as simple as recirculating your mash to ensure the clarity of your wort? You recirculate your mash all the time, Jordan. What are your thoughts on wort clarity and how it contributes to, downstream effects on the finished beer?
Well, it's interesting if you think about it. I believe that the Lodo people ultimately do think that a pump is the lesser of the two evils. And I'm guessing it's a function of the wort clarity they think they're achieving. Because if they're this worried about any sort of oxygen exposure during the mash, you would think they wouldn't be pumping at all. And yet they're big proponents of clear wort going into the fermenter or even the boil kettle for that matter. And so clearly they think that this has some sort of impact on the final quality of the beer. On the Lodo side, they think that a lot of these particulates that should stay in the mash, should those end up in your fermenter, they can actually create some staling effects and mitigate some of that beautiful malt character in some of the more delicate malty lagers. And so, we have tricks for clarity at this point, biofine, gelatin, you name it. Yeah. But even if we set those aside and just ignore the fact that you can force clarity, there may be some sort of downstream effect for at least more delicate styles as it relates to clear wort and the fermenter.
Yeah. And that again, I'm of the opinion that clear wort doesn't really have much of an impact on clarity at all. Or at least I haven't been able to show that, especially if you're employing the use of certain fining agents and all of that. But maybe there is some positives to have, fermenting clear wort when it comes to like flavor stability and stuff like that. Now, the downsides or potential downsides, we should qualify that, to recirculating the mash. I think the biggest one that at least that comes to my mind is hot side aeration. And all that is, it's exactly how it sounds, is the wort prior to the boil or during the boil. I guess during the boil wouldn't really matter because you're boiling it, but prior to the boil, that wort being exposed to oxygen, which many claim increases the risk of oxidation occurring in the finished beer through the production of some form of these oxidized compounds in the wort that somehow make it so you can tell that I'm not convinced that this is something to worry about these days. But the argument is that hot side aeration could lead to potential stability issues in the finished beer. Your thoughts on hot side aeration, Jordan?
I do think it's a thing, but I think that the vast majority of styles, it does not matter. I think that the majority, if not pretty much all of American beer has some level of hot side aeration present in it. And I think that our palates are accustomed to it. I think on the lager side, you can make a really beautiful lager with really potent malt character if you can avoid hot side aeration. And we should always do our best to avoid it, not intentionally splashing.
Sure.
But if you go extreme, you can make these really beautiful lagers that have just so much incredible malt character. But in my opinion, that's not appropriate in an IPA. I mean, that might not even be appropriate in a Saison. And so I have some Lodo friends, and when they've done full-blown Lodo on these more modern styles, it's just not right, in my opinion. It's like, just like you wouldn't put, cinnamon in your lasagna, right? It's like there's a time and a place for every ingredient, every process. And I think that it really does make a difference, but I think you can make great lager without it. Some of the best lager brewers in America are not, doing Lodo techniques. But I think that there are certain styles you probably wouldn't even want that character in there in the first place.
That's fascinating. I'd actually never heard that or thought of that myself, that whatever this is that the Lodo crew talks about might not actually be appropriate in other styles. Like it's not a one size fits all type of an approach. Now, if let's say you're making a Helles or something and you're really going to try to avoid hot side aeration, are you going to flip the switch on your recirculator on your clawhammer unit?
Yeah, and so what I do is I actually do a full volume mash that maxes out the system. And so my the way that the clawhammer system works is the mash is recirculated through the lid, and so there's this like port that connects a QD and it sprays it out. And so that spraying action would, in theory, aerate the wort. And so when I do a full volume mash, the nub of the sprayer is submerged in the mash liquid. And so at the very least, it's not spraying, it's just like flowing, if you will. And so I do use the pump, but I have been dreaming of doing a Lodo experiment on the clawhammer. It would be a lot of work, and I wouldn't be able to do things completely in unison. I would have to probably do a stage brew day because I would think I would need to use both systems because what they're doing is they're underletting. And so I would need to use both of my twin clawhammer units to heat the water up in one and then push it over to the other one that already had the grains in it, and then let it fill to the top, and then I would begin the second. And actually, after that mash was done, I would then need to, instead of pulling the basket up like we normally would, which is going to drip and create hot side aeration, I then have to underlet that back into the other system, and then I could pursue my second, standard all-in-one brew day. So I really would like to test this someday, but you can make incredible lager with standard processes. So I've just lost the interest and the effort.
Yeah, and like you said, so many great, American lager breweries that we know of, they're employing traditional German techniques to reduce aeration and oxidation overall, of course. But, it's not to the extent to that certain people claim you need to do to get this it character. So regardless, another downside to me, at least, and maybe for some people this isn't, but is the cost. In order to be able to recirculate your wort, you have to have some way of pulling it from the bottom of your kettle and getting it back into the mash. And that usually is going to be either an external pump or buying a unit that has a built-in pump so that you can recirculate. So, if you are just a brew in a bag brewer who is, using an old turkey burner or something like that, buying a pump may not be something you want to do. And so recirculation is sort of off the table at that point.
I really tend to avoid costly upgrades on home brewing. At this point, over the course of the last, 13 years, whatever it is that I've been brewing, of course, I've accumulated a lot over the years. But as soon as something comes out, I don't run and go buy it. And so pump was one of those. I resisted it for years. I brewed, I think I got a pump right before COVID started because I was changing systems. I'd moved into a new house, and I needed the pump to get the wort out of my whatever it's called, Braumeister.
Braumeister.
I needed a pump to get the Braumeister out of the Braumeister into my fermenter because it was so big and so heavy it was on the ground, and there would be no way to get it out otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so I had to buy a third-party product. I got the Blickman Riptide. That pump is awesome, but it's like $200. And so that's, something that you think twice about it, right? And so if you can get away with not using one, why bother? Because in addition to the cost, they're like just one other annoying thing to deal with. They can break, they can get clogged or whatever. They can get it so you can't get like the flow going. So you have to like prime it and get that figured out. You got to make sure you keep them clean. It's like I don't need any more hassles in my brew day, and so I avoided it like the plague forever until it became a reality that I had to have one if I was going to use that system.
Yeah, and you mentioned cleaning. That's my biggest downside to pumps. I probably bought, I got the old chugger pump when those were popular. I bought some of these smaller, really cool, they're like $25-$30 on Amazon. Just these smaller pumps that did the trick, worked really well. But the reason I moved away from it was I was seeing no meaningful positive impact on the beers that I was brewing. And I was absolutely seeing a negative impact on the amount of time I had to spend cleaning and worrying about what the insides of these pumps look like, that it just wasn't worth it for me. That is the main reason I don't use pumps anymore in my brewing, is that I just don't like not being able to see inside and then having to take them apart to ensure they're clean, and all of that process for what? It wasn't doing anything for me. But if you can get this thing that at least you view as being a meaningful positive impact from employing the use of a pump to recirculate your mash, then maybe it's worth it for you. Can you think of any other downside? Those were the three main things for me, were hot side aeration, the cost, and cleaning.
No, I can't really think of any other downsides, but I will say there's probably some upsides also on the boil side that, if you have this pump in place, you can also use it to recirculate your wort during the whirlpooling stage. It also can assist with kind of cleaning in place by moving the wort around. Yeah. And I will say they're really not that. They kind of improve the cleaning process, and that forces you to clean it in place. But the big thing is that you really need to get this thing cleaned immediately, just like you would a plate chiller. And so with the pump, you can't all right, I'll clean this up tomorrow. You've really got to scrub that kettle out, get that PBW in there, and start recirculating it, because you do not want your pump to be a source of contamination for your downstream fermentation.
Amen. And I'll tell you, the same exact sentiment I have for pumps is the same for plate chillers. Mm-hmm. I had a plate chiller for about a year. I think I used it about 10, 15 times. And I bought it, my own money. It wasn't and I gave it away. I could not. The reason I gave it away is I felt awful, to selling something like that to somebody, when it would take me, I would clean immediately after brewing. And still, when I would sanitize my plate chiller, with hot wort or even hot sanitizer, prior to using it in the next batch, it would spit out this black flaky stuff. I just was not having it. We could do a whole episode just on preference, our views on different chilling mechanisms. I am anti-plate chiller and anti-pump, but again, for some people, maybe it's a good thing. Now, the experiment we're going to get to in the next segment was done on a cream ale. So just real quickly, the BJCP description of a cream ale is a clean, well-attenuated, flavorful American, quote, lawnmower beer. Easily drinkable and refreshing with more character than typical American lagers. I like to refer to it just as a basically an American lager fermented with an ale yeast or a hybrid yeast, as they refer to them. But in thinking about cream ale with the application of mash recirculation, what might we expect to see?
I mean, it's about as bland of a beer as there is, right? And so if this, was going to have any sort of flavor impact on the final product, you would think that a cream ale would really let that variable shine through. I think it's a fantastic style. It's flavorful, yet, not over the top like an IPA or Russian Imperial Stout or anything like that. And, kind of standard gravity. And so also a good opportunity to see if there's any observable impacts in terms of OG or FG. And so, and it's supposed to be, kind of clear. And so we might see something, see what we can see that way as well. So I think it's a good style to test this variable.
Yeah, all of what you said is exactly my thoughts, that it's, if we're going to see any impact, even if let's just pretend for a minute that, there's no claims that recirculating the mash is going to improve beer flavor or aroma, we should still be able to see higher OG in the recirculated mash, batch. And to me, that might be just enough for somebody to convince them, yeah, I need to start doing this. Now, as I just mentioned, I don't recirculate. I've recirculated many mashes in my day, and I've opted to no longer employ that technique because I just didn't notice much of a difference in flavor or clarity when I was recirculating. But am I missing out on something good? Jordan, you put it to the test. Those results when we're back from this break.
October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, a reminder that your digital life is always at risk. Every day, hackers steal identities, drain bank accounts, and open fraudulent accounts. LifeLock is here with tips to help prevent you from becoming a victim. Use strong passwords, set up multi-factor authentication on your accounts, report scams, and update the software on your devices. And for peace of mind, get LifeLock. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second for threats to your identity. If your identity is stolen, a LifeLock US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Plus, LifeLock plans include the $1 Million Protection Package, meaning LifeLock will reimburse you to your plan's limits if you lose money due to identity theft. Stay smart, stay safe, and stay protected. Get comprehensive identity protection with a 30-day free trial at LifeLock.com. Use promo code NEWS. That's LifeLock.com, promo code NEWS for 30 days free. Terms apply.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. When reviewing our year-over-year data from our annual General Homebrewer Survey, one thing is very clear. Electric brewing systems have blown up in popularity over the last 5 to 6 years, meaning many more homebrewers just have the ability to easily flip a switch to recirculate their mash. Curious whether this has a noticeable impact on beer characteristics. Among other things, you designed an experiment to test it out, Jordan.
Well, this experiment kind of designed itself because I broke my pump. So I don't remember how exactly. Yeah, I think what happened was I was like moving the system around, and the way that the claw hammer works is it has a out spout towards the bottom, which then connects to a pump, which is sits below it perhaps, and then out of the pump goes something to the top. And I moved the system, and the connecting tube pulled the pump and it dropped it to the ground, and it like broke it in half, basically. Totally my fault. And so while I was waiting for a new pump to be shipped to me, I was like, you know what? We should really test this whole recirculation thing to begin with, because in part I was just curious, would it impact mash efficiency, but clearly interested to know, does it actually have a sensory impact on the final beer as well?
Yeah, and I think I think we had done 2 sort of like recirculated mash experiments prior to this one, but this one on a cream ale I felt was just a really good direction to take it because of how, like we talked about in the last segment, how light and simple and arguably delicate this beer is. You called it bland. I would say deliciously bland. It's intentionally bland, and that's a good thing because it's going to allow any of the or any impact of the variable to really shine.
And let's get into the recipe because I absolutely adore this recipe. This is modeled after the Spotted Cow, which in my opinion is kind of the gold standard of cream ale.
Amen.
Rumor has it doesn't use corn anymore. And my friend from Wisconsin says, oh, they use corn again now. So who knows if they're using corn or not. But notably, my cream ale has no corn in it, and some people might find that blasphemous, but I'm telling you, this recipe is amazing. So this is 59% Pilsner malt, 26% Pale Two-Row malt, 11% flaked barley, and 4% Weirmann Carahel. And so and I brewed this in 2 5-gallon batches in my 240-volt claw hammer supply units. And so I have a very simple brewing process for this one. Another blasphemous thing here, just a single infusion mash, 152F or 67C. And at that point, it's time to introduce the variable, right? Because I have a broken pump on my hands. And so one of those was left undisturbed at that 152F, while the other one was continuously recirculated via the pump.
Pretty simple setup here. And to go back to your recipe, one thing I have heard, this is a total aside, but one thing I've heard a lot of pro brewers have been doing more recently, maybe they've been doing it forever, is not using like flaked maize, corn, but just adding dextrose to their boiling wort to get that drier, because that's really the whole point in adding corn anyways. But dextrose, I don't think, is going to contribute any corny flavor, which you might expect from using something like flaked maize. That'd be an interesting experiment. Do like 20% flaked maize to 20% dextrose, try to hit that same OG and then compare those two beers. Anyways, just wanted to comment on that. I'm still a corn user because it's fun to throw, cornflakes into your mash, in my opinion. But yeah, I like the design of this one. And again, broken pump or not, this is a great comparison, just because we want to see what impact this recirculated mash actually is going to have on a cream ale.
So once those 60-minute mashes were complete, I removed the grain baskets and let that drip down and took a sample of each wort for the visual comparison. And this is where things get interesting.
Yes.
So I could not believe it. And I think I took a second sample of each to make sure I didn't screw it up. But look at the photo, go to the website, look at this article. The recirculated wort has a ton of visible particulate in it, whereas the stagnant mash was pretty darn clear. And so I was pretty blown away because the whole idea here is that, a recirculated mash leads to clearer wort.
Yeah, I'm looking at the photo right now, and I don't know if clear is the proper word to use, but it's certainly more free of particulate matter, especially compared to the sample that was recirculated, which is odd because part of the reason people recirculate is because that mash creates this filter, that grain bed, right? A natural filter. And that did not seem to be filtering out much in this. And I'm assuming you took these samples toward the end of the mash rest.
Yeah, I think that I actually took it from the wort that was below the mash baskets that had been pulled out. And so, in retrospect, maybe this is kind of intuitive because one's just sitting there and everything settles to the bottom, whereas the other one, you're ripping it through the entire time. And so you could see how you could pull out little pieces of husk or whatever it is that are ultimately going to be in the wort that you boil.
Right. It's surprising in as much as people claim that it creates clearer wort. Not surprising on when you actually think about what's going on. I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. But we've messed around Trub a lot, and a little bit of Trub is fine. So I don't think the beer is ruined. So let's see what happens. So we proceeded to boil that wort for 60 minutes. I'm using a beautiful blend of Tettnanger, Satz, and Saphir in this. We've got 64 grams of Tettnanger at 60 minutes, 28 grams of Satz at 10, and 28 grams of Saphir at 5. I don't think that Spotted Cow would be using Saphir when they first developed the recipe. That was probably a riff that I put on there. And I don't know how much you've messed around with Saphir, but it's got this really beautiful kind of interesting like Noble Plus element where it's not like Citra, but it's not just the spice of Satz and Tettnanger. And it gets a little bit of this like fruity yet noble thing, and which I think works as an aroma addition.
Yeah, I don't disagree at all. I'd probably just swap out the Saphir with Tettnanger because I love Tettnanger so much in really delicate pale styles like this. That being said, I bought a ton of Saphir as soon as I learned that that's what Firestone Walker uses in Pivo Pills. And I agree with you. There is the one thing that it adds that I feel you don't get from Tettnanger, Satz, maybe Hallertau Mittelfruit is this more American fruitiness. It's not pungent. It's not strong. It's just, if you're geeking out and really focusing, I feel like I can detect a little bit more of that fruity edge, but it just a beautiful hop, again, very much in line with your classic noble hops.
And I think that a lot of people might be tempted just to throw in a single 60-minute boil edition for something like this. But in my opinion, almost every style benefits from some aroma additions. And so it's just one of those Jordan flares that I add.
I love it.
So once these boils are finished, I'm seeing that both refractometer readings, to my astonishment, were the same.
Yeah.
1048 OG. How is this possible? Recirculation is supposed to increase mash efficiency.
Were you not, not joking here, were you not fully expecting the recirculated mash to have a higher OG?
Absolutely. I would have thought maybe 1048 to 1052 or something like that. Not double the OG, but, some observable difference. None.
Yeah, something making it worthwhile to do it, I couldn't agree more when I saw that this was 1048 for the recirculated mash and 1048 for the one that sat still. Obviously my brain goes to, the modern malts that we're using these days are just so hot and so good that maybe recirculation it's another one of those things that could potentially go the way of the dodo or, because of the fact that we've got such good quality ingredients now, but fascinating, direct observation there.
Insane. So once again, we have another thing that confounds the common, assumptions surrounding recirculation. So then I chilled that down to 59F or 15C, kind of my standard approach for my warm lager ferments. So I'm pitching a single pouch of Imperial Yeast L26 Pilgrimage. Imperial, if you're listening, please bring it back. We loved it. And let that ferment at that kind of warm, cool temperature, which I think really works for the cream ale. There's a lot of debate. Do we ferment a ale strain cold? Do we ferment a lager strain warm? As you know, I tend to just use lager yeast for everything. And this is a great opportunity to ferment your lager a little warmer.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And my approach is very similar to yours, except, me, I'm going with like global at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19C when I'm making cream ale, and I love the way it turns out. But Pilgrimage, yes, I never used it, but I've absolutely had beers made with it. And man, Imperial, bring it back. It's just good stuff.
So after fermenting for 10 days, I'm taking some hydrometer measurements. I see that the beers are finished, but we have a very slight difference in FG. The recirculated batch finished at 1016, whereas the non-recirculated finished at 1017.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Crazy. That first off, that kind of goes along with what we say all the time, which is there are always going to be some variations between the, as anal as we are about keeping things identical between the batches, there's going to be some variation. Is one specific gravity point something we're going to point to and say, recirculation did have an impact. I don't know why it would cause better attenuation by one specific gravity, but I'm also not convinced that is going to be, lead to a perceptible difference in any, form down the road.
Right. And so it's hard to be totally confident that this is a function of the variable. It could be just, the natural deviations that happen in fermentation. Budweiser, they have to blend batches because they're, seeing inevitable slight differences from batch to batch. And so that scale and that level of consistency, you have to blend. And so maybe this is natural variation. Or maybe, in fact, this is a function of the variable. And if you think about how the claw hammer system works, they have a heating element at the bottom of the kettle / all-in-one unit. And they have a temperature probe also at the bottom area. And so the temperature measurements are not too far from the heating element, and they're at the bottom of the vessel, so the bottom of your big mash, whereas the recirculation is pumping the wort to the top. And my guess is that the way that you're able to dial in a consistent temperature in terms of what it reads on the Clawhammer digital readout versus like your hand thermometer to double check it is it's dialing in that recirculated process. And I think that is how they're able to achieve a fairly accurate temperature readout, and then temperature control is a function of that recirculation. And the system, I don't think, is meant to work in a stagnant way, at least if that's how you have your temperature settings dialed in, because in the Clawhammer, you can do adjustments to the observed temperature relative on the system relative to what you're getting on an external thermometer. And so mine are adjusted for a recirculated mash. And so I could see how there's either some stratification happening, or it's just not accurately reading it. And maybe it was actually hotter, at least at the bottom, maybe, than, the digital readout would lead us to believe. Who knows?
So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that it may very well be that the recirculated mash, we'll call it, was the more accurate temperature that the Clawhammer was providing, which maybe happened to be a degree or two cooler ultimately than what the non-recirculated mash was that inevitably had some stratification.
Could be that. Also, maybe something about the kinetics of a wort that's recirculating produces something that's more fermentable, even if the temperature is the same. So who knows? It could be two of those things. I will also add, as a weird side note here, I really struggle with high FG in my brewery. And so, I'll see fellow contributors that'll mash at 152 and finish at 1008. Yeah. And if I need to mash at 147 and add a bucket of enzyme and sugar to get down to 1008. And so I don't know what it is about my house, but I really struggle with high FGs, and so I have to kind of pull out other tricks to get, if I want a drier beer, I just can't mash above 148 really.
That's so interesting. I had a friend who was having that issue for a long time. And all his beers started finishing in the low 1020s. And, lo and behold, his thermometer was broken. It was uncalibrated, and he was mashing about 12 degrees warmer than he thought. So I don't know, something to check out. But anyways, at this point, your beers were done. What did you do after taking their FG?
So I cold crashed them to 32F or 0 Celsius for a few days, and then pressure transferred those to CO2 purge serving kegs that were placed on gas in the keezer, and I left them lager for a week before they're ready for evaluation. And I'll note that, that's kind of the nice thing about cream ale. You don't necessarily have to ramp down. You don't have to lager forever. It's a little more rustic, if you will, and lends itself to kind of a quicker turnaround if you want to, if you're inclined to otherwise kind of follow tradition.
Yeah, I agree with you. You already have it kind of cool enough, so if you don't want a cold crash, you don't have to, but you can. And this beer should be, ultimately crystal clear. I'm looking at the photos on the website now, and other than what seems to be a little bit of condensation on the glass, these look like commercial bright. Were they pretty clear when you pulled both of them? Neither of them looked different at all, in my opinion.
Yeah, they looked pretty clear, really identical looking, deep gold, good clarity, white cap of foam with good retention. Maybe that retention is a function of the flaked barley, but incredible beers, really, really yummy.
And so, before we serve our beers to blind tasters for a triangle test, we always do a series of semi-blind triangle tests ourselves, usually served by somebody else. And they're the ones who know what the odd beer out is. Out of the 5 semi-blind triangle tests that you attempted, Jordan, as the person who knew everything about these beers, from the variable, the way they were brewed, the ingredients, how well did you do on those 5?
So my process is I'll pour two and, take that photo that you see on the website, and then I'll sit with each of them and really try to sidedly find the differences between the two of them. And even if I can find what I think are cited differences, I might still struggle to get them in a blind scenario. I would contend that if maybe some of these really fringe differences that are pretty small, it's really challenging to get in a blind triangle. But when, studying for my test, I could not really differentiate these. They tasted the same, they smelled the same, they looked the same. So when I go to do it blind, what are the odds? I got 0 out of 5 right.
That's insanely rare. That is actually more rare. That just because random guessing, you'd expect to get, between 1 and 2, you'd pick the right one or the odd beer out 1 or 2 times out of 5 if they're identical beers. And so that's rare, but we probably get 0 out of 5 in our blind triangles, our semi-blind triangles, less often than we actually consistently pick the odd beer out in our semi-blind triangles. So I thought that was interesting, but it really goes to show that in your, despite knowing everything about these beers, to your palate at least, these beers tasted exactly the same. There were no differences that you could tell apart. Did you find any issues with these beers, or were they as good as you intended?
No, yeah, they were great. And I'm sitting here wondering, why the heck have I not brewed a cream ale in a while? This might have been the last one I brewed, so it's time to get back on that.
Oh my God, I couldn't agree more. It's one of the styles on the top of my list when I get my brewery back up and running. In part because I think it's very approachable for my new neighbors, and I've said it before. I kind of need to impress them. So, well, our impressions aren't the reason we do the experiments. What we like to do is get data from blind tasters who have no idea what the variable is, because we really want to determine, can people actually perceive a difference between these beers based on the variable that we're testing out. In this case, obviously, it's mash recirculation. So you served this beer to 21 participants, out of which 12 would have needed to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some level of confidence that, hey, it really does seem like mash recirculation had a meaningful impact on the quality of these beers. Out of those 21, again, we needed 12. How many actually picked the odd beer out?
We got 10, which is 48% of tasters, which is not significant. And so, at least in this case, tasters could not reliably tell a cream ale apart from one that was recirculated from one that wasn't.
Yeah, and I don't think at this point, with everything else we've talked about, people are listening and going, "Wow, I'm so surprised." You probably saw this coming, and it's just fascinating to me, because where I really expected to see the biggest impact of the recirculated mash was in the OG. I didn't expect it to have any impact on clarity. And between us, Jordan, I didn't expect it to have any, perceptible impact either. But I did think that you could eke out a few more points of conversion by recirculating the mash. And the fact that both were identical, I mean, it's cause for pause for me. I'm sitting there going, this is so interesting. Really, I don't think I am losing out much by not, choosing to recirculate, at least on the homebrew scale. Now, I have to imagine commercially on these huge, 40-barrel brewery systems, that yes, the recirculation is going to get them at least a little bit more conversion, which is going to cost less money per batch, meaning that they increase their profits. That's the reason they do these things. But for homebrewers, at least for me, it seems like it may not necessarily have much of an impact. And I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and this was isolated to the Clawhammer 10-gallon 240-volt system, so maybe other systems you really do need that recirculation. So it's kind of hard to say. And also on the FG, it kind of had just a light bulb just now. We've shown that trub does positively impact attenuation. So maybe the extra trub that's being pulled into the boil from the recirculation is actually what caused the extra point of attenuation, not any sort of temperature differences.
That's a really interesting idea. I don't know if enough trub would have made it in there, but also, when we do our trub experiments, it's however much trub makes its way to the fermenter, not necessarily the boil kettle, but I would imagine those worts, when they were next to each other, I mean, if you're pulling in that much more particulate, if it stayed consistent throughout the entire draining of the mash, right, through your lautering process, then yeah, maybe more trub made it into the fermentation vessel and thus resulted in a little bit better attenuation. Who knows? The cool thing is you couldn't taste them apart, and neither could tasters, at least reliably, tell them apart. And so, hey, whether you choose, in my opinion at least, whether you choose to recirculate or not, it seems like you're going to end up with the beer that you are more or less, hoping to make. And I think that's kind of cool. So a couple of reader comments to get to. The first one comes from Tobias, who says the higher FG is probably because of the higher mash temp. I guess the recirculation maintains the correct mash temperature better. I think what he's referring to here, Jordan, and maybe I'm wrong, is kind of what I mentioned earlier, that by recirculating, you are ensuring a more consistent mash temperature as opposed to potentially having hot spots and cooler spots in the mash, which, one could kind of presume the still mash had.
Yeah, I agree. And I think as I think more about this, I think that this might expose that in a single infusion mash, recirculation isn't that big of a deal, especially when we're talking about one FG difference. But in a step mash, you probably want to recirculate, or you might see more exaggerated issues related to overheating of the bottom, underheating of the top, et cetera.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a really good point, that if you are performing these kind of traditional step mashes at different temperatures, the idea there is that you're not holding them for very long, 15 minutes or so. But the idea is to hit a very specific temperature, and if recirculation allows you to stay right at that temperature, 113 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, then probably not a bad idea to recirculate so that you're I guess you have more confidence in the consistency of that temperature. Another thought I had was that perhaps, you had mentioned single infusion, but I'm going to take it one step further and say single infusion, full volume, either brew in a bag, brew in a basket, on one of these electric things, batch sparging. Maybe it doesn't have much of an impact there, but I could see if you're doing a continuous sparge, the recirculation just continues to go on until you get to the boil step, basically. And so perhaps there is a different impact there. And, a similar comparison as this experiment, but on two beers that are actually continuously sparged on a traditional approach, maybe we would see more of an impact there. Because a lot of these methods came up from people who were, brewing all grain using a continuous sparge method.
Yeah, and I also wonder if it's a function of batch size too. You would think that recirculation could get really important once you get into the barrels, and that if you have the smaller your vessel, the smaller your mash, the more easy it is to maintain a consistent temperature. And so maybe at the batch size that I'm making, it's just not big enough to vary much. Also, I am using the insulator, exteriors on the clawhammer units, which helps maintain the temperature inside. It also does have a heating element. So if that temperature probe recognizes that it's lost temp, it can click it back on just for long enough to maintain that temp. So it might be a function of mash size. And as I think about this, Marshall, do you know, are recirculations of the mash common in pro brewing, or are they using mash mixers?
That's a good point. Yeah, I refer to it as recirculation, but really, I think they're using mixing more than they are recirculation. But I don't know. I'm sure there are some, pro breweries out there, or brewing setups that do recirculate. But the reason I say that is because it's hard for me to believe that this thing that is so insanely common nowadays is just for homebrewers. I mean, homebrewers tend to copy the commercial brewers out there. So I really don't know, but interesting thoughts either way. Final comment comes from Mike, who says, very thought-provoking experiment here. My understanding as to why recirculating for clarity works in the first place is because you're using the mash bed as kind of a filter, similar to the curds and clarified milk punch. I have no idea what that is. It makes me think of the book A Clockwork Orange, their Moloko or whatever, but I've never had clarified milk punch. I suspect a system with a more traditional false bottom, Mike says, would have performed better since it's forming the wort to percolate through the whole mash bed. That said, it's surprising how the recirculated wort actually had more particulate in it. It really calls into question whether it's worth doing for brew in a bag systems, be it a bag or a basket, Mike says.
That's a really good point. I can't help but wonder if some of the things that we're witnessing here are a function of the brew in a basket, maybe in a more old school, full multi-vessel system. It would matter more, or maybe it'd make a clear wort.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where my opinion, where I've settled on my opinion with this, is that I am fully brew in a bag now, brew in a bag, brew in a basket, whatever it is. And I mean, 99% of the time, full volume sparging, or no sparging, full volume mashing. And so I just don't see how recirculating the mash is going to have much of an impact given what the claims are about what mash recirculation is used for. It really does seem more like a technique that you would employ, in my mind at this point, for full, for fly sparge brewing, and that's just my thoughts. I've not seen any benefit, so I'm going to stick with, doing what I do, which means not having to clean pumps and stuff like that. So, Jordan, do you have any last words on mash recirculation before we wrap up?
Well, I will say that I got a new pump from Kleinheimer Supply, and I've been recirculating every mash since. And so I think that I've got the piece of equipment. It's there. Maybe it's doing absolutely nothing, but I do tend to use the Whirlpool arm because I'm using a immersion chiller. And in theory, that recirculation of the wort helps chill the beer faster. And so if I'm going to use it for that, I might as well use it for the mash. And so it's there, I use it. But if I break both, I think I can still brew until I replace them.
Exactly. And I like that your reasoning is basically may as well. I mean, it's already there. I'm going to use it for the boil anyways. And I think in that, that's the kind of reasoning that I can get behind. So, well, don't forget to check out the rad brewing content Martin is creating over at The Brülosophy Show, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/@The Brülosophy Show. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brülosophy Show with no umlaut. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on Brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit Patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go